So I'd like to welcome everyone to the third meeting of the President's Commission on Combating Drug Addiction and the Opioid Crisis. I'd especially like to welcome our newest Commission member, Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi. Thank you for your efforts on this important issue. So the topic of today's meeting is innovative pain management and prevention measures for diversion. On the Commission's website, you can find the agenda for this meeting, minutes and videos of past meetings, dates and times of future meetings, and a copy of the Commission's interim report. That's at www.whitehouse.gov/ONDCP, and you can find a link there to a page for the President's Commission. Chairman Christie has extended the commission by 1 month, so it plans to issue its final report by November 1st of this year. The public is also invited to submit written comments for the commission's consideration by emailing them to commission@ondcp.eop.gov. So I wish to thank Governor Christie, the commission members, Richard Baum, the executive director of the commission and acting director of ONDCP, Secretary Shulkin, and the federal agency representatives and the witnesses. And with that, I'll hand it over to the governor.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. We welcome those comments that Michael talked about from the public. After our last meeting here, we got over 8,000 comments that were brought to the commission. The commission reviewed those 8,000 comments, and they definitely played an impact upon the interim report that we issued shortly thereafter. I want to thank the members of the President's administration who are here today as well. We appreciate your participation. Many of you have been here before. Kellyanne and Reed Cordish have been here before. Richard Baum, obviously from ONDCP, we appreciate it. A former colleague of mine, Rachel Brand, it's good to see you, Rachel. We were in DOJ years ago, and now she is back, so thank you for being here to represent the Department of Justice. As Michael said, we have a particular focus on today's meeting, which is to talk to leaders in science across the country about the issues that are confronting us regarding the opioid epidemic, and attempting to get input and information from those experts regarding their ideas on how to deal with this epidemic. Since our last meeting, myself, Congressman Kennedy, and Councilor Conway went and visited the Lewis Stokes Veterans Hospital in Cleveland, Ohio, and there was it was an extraordinary trip. They have lowered the rate of opioid prescriptions to veterans there by more than double-digit amounts, by recommending alternate therapies, alternate treatments for pain management, by really changing the culture inside that entire hospital to say that opioids are not the first resort for pain management. And this has had a great effect not only on the lowering of the number of opioids that are being prescribed, but it has also shown even better results for pain management for many of the veterans. And so it was fascinating for us to hear from this medical staff as members of the commission, and the results from that trip will be included in our final report. I want to just welcome everybody who is watching this on live stream. We appreciate everyone who is participating in the meeting today. I'm going to try to keep us on schedule. We'll see if I can. We started 5 minutes late, which means we're 10 minutes ahead for most meetings in Washington, D.C., so we start off in a really good spot. I want to welcome my fellow commission members who are here as well, and add my welcome to Attorney General Bondi. We look forward to visiting Florida and with some of the efforts that she's making, particularly in the neonatal area, that we think can be scaled for the rest of the country. And welcome back Congressman Kennedy and Governors Cooper and Baker and Professor Madras, and thank them for all the work they've been doing since we were together the last time as we prepare for a final report to the President on November 1st. So I want to turn over some additional remarks to the Counselor to the President, Kellyanne Conway, as we begin the meeting. Kellyanne, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Governor. Thank you, Commission members and everyone who's joined us today here and online. Nearly 27 million Americans suffer from chronic pain or daily pain, and over 11 million Americans over the age of 12 abused opioids last year. We know that is an emerging health crisis of urgent proportions, and this president has, from day one, really put his full presidential will and platform behind working together with individuals and organizations like you to help combat what is becoming an epidemic across our nation. No state has been spared, no demographic group has been untouched. This is no longer someone else's coworker, someone else's kid, someone else's community. We are increasingly encountering people all across the country who have been touched by opioids in some negative way and fashion. The fact that opioids for many individuals in this country first comes into their consciousness, if not conversation, because they open up a family medicine cabinet and see a bottle with the local pharmacy and the family doctor on the label. It was meant to help someone at some point somehow. And so it's a very different type of first experience for many Americans with this particular drug, class of drugs. And so we recognize that, but we also recognize it as an opportunity to educate and to engage Americans as to the facts of misusing what could otherwise be a very helpful pharmaceutical for many Americans. As the President continues to monitor and anticipate the final report of this commission, he has directed many different agencies and departments across his cabinet and across the federal government to pitch in with interdiction, with treatment and recovery, and with prevention. We also, as a White House, wish to lend our support to those who are helping to destigmatize opioid misuse. We know that many Americans are reluctant to ask for help, to come forward to those even closest to them in their family and friends and colleague circles to say, I need help. Help is there. And so we would like to, as part of our priority, to also reach out to those in need and those who are helping those in need, to let you know that we hear you and we see you, and we want to lock hands and work on solving this crisis together. Thank you, Governor.
Kellyanne, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Reed Cordish, who's Assistant to the President for Intergovernmental and Technology Initiatives, has been very involved in this effort as well. Reed, we welcome you and invite your remarks.
Thank you, Governor. I want to thank the Commission for the incredibly thoughtful and detailed interim report. And I want to let you know that the President has offices and agencies across government making incredible progress every day on implementing the recommendations that were contained within this interim report. We also eagerly await the final report. This was a crisis 20 years in the making. We know that it's going to take the full focus and commitment of the government and the full commitment of the private sector in order to solve it. But we're going to have that, and we are going to solve it. And we thank you for your continued focus and efforts on this.
Great, Reed, thank you. And thank you for your focus as well. We're going to start with remarks from Dr. Francis Collins, who, as all of you know, is the Director of the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Collins has been an extraordinary resource and partner with this commission in our already relatively short time of being, and we could not have accomplished some of the things that we've been able to accomplish already without the support and the advice and counsel of Dr. Collins. I welcome him here today and thank him for his help and invite his remarks.
Thank you, Governor, and thank you for your personal deep attention to this and your leadership, and to all the members of the Commission for the hard work you have put into putting forward a very impressive interim set of recommendations, and with great expectations that on November 1st we'll have an even richer array of recommendations that we intend to look at very carefully. Also want to say my thanks to Kellyanne Conway and Reed Cordish, who've been wonderful partners with us in this effort. I am Francis Collins. I'm the Director of the National Institutes of Health, the largest supporter of biomedical research in the world, and really pleased to join you to talk about new solutions to this important and timely issue, a public health crisis of major proportions. More people are dying of opioid overdoses than died of HIV/AIDS, even in the peak of that terrible epidemic. I want to point to Dr. Nora Volkoff, who's directly across from me, who's the Director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse at NIH, and who's been a central figure in the things that I want to mention to you about partnerships that we are aiming to initiate with much partnership from the private sector. We want to build on ongoing research on opioid misuse and on pain, and that's something that NIH has a lot of investments in, but we need partners from all sectors to make that happen. Of the 2 million Americans addicted to opioids, as Kellyanne said, most of them started with prescription medicines, and They have been trapped in a rewiring of their brain, which is very specifically making it almost impossible without medication assistance to be able to recover from this addiction. And while there are effective treatments for opioid use disorder, MAT, they are underutilized, and the number of options is limited. Furthermore, we as doctors don't even really know how to make these medications work for all patients. For example, relapse rates after treatment are way too high, and the duration of treatment that's needed for sustained abstinence is not really known for most patients. Recent neuroscience research has revolutionized our understanding of the pathways involved in addiction and pain, and so new non-addictive pain medicines can now be pursued and are urgently needed. Our goal, in line with the recommendation from the Commission's interim report, is to build a partnership between researchers in academia and in industry, with help from the government, and particularly here, NIH, and I want to call out FDA, has been an incredibly important partner in this as well, and patients, particularly patients, to cut in half the time that's needed to make available new, potent, and non-addictive medications for pain and for addiction. We've worked successfully before in other ways, NIH, FDA, and industry, as in the formation of the Accelerating Medicines Partnership, a public-private partnership that has involved 10 biopharmaceutical companies and other nonprofits, along with NIH and FDA, to develop new diagnostics and treatments for Alzheimer's disease, for diabetes, for autoimmune disorders, for Parkinson's disease. And we can do this for opioids as well. In March of this year, I proposed developing such a public-private partnership on opioid use disorders to President Trump, and he charged me to do everything possible to bring this together. So in April, at a meeting I attended with the heads of research and development of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies, there was consensus amongst those leaders that such a partnership was needed. With help from industry, we convened academic experts, government agencies, and pharmaceutical industry experts on how we could tackle this crisis together in a series of 3 intense meetings at NIH. And then working with Bill Chin, who's here, and with Steve Ubel, who will speak right after me, at Pharma, with a variety of companies, with FDA, and thanks to your leadership, Governor Christie, we gathered last week in Trenton to define a plan for the partnerships. And those have emerged, I think, in a very compelling way. There are 2 themes. The first focuses on medications to treat addiction and to reverse overdose. Changes to formulations and combinations of drugs that are currently in use could be very helpful in providing additional options for treatment. New uses for compounds that aren't currently being used for medication-assisted treatment, but could in fact turn out to be valuable in that way. And giving doctors and patients, therefore, flexibility in treatment options and a higher chance of long-term recovery. The second theme focuses on the development of potent but non-addictive medications for pain. Let's be clear, 25 million Americans suffer from pain daily. What we must not do is to walk away from that need, but we need to offer them opportunities for treatment that do not carry with them this terrible consequence. And frankly, treatment of chronic pain with opioids is not very successful anyway. We desperately need other alternatives in that space. That means working with industry and with a lot of enthusiasm from our partners. We could begin with a focused data sharing effort. Industry has been developing alternative pain medicines, but many of those are still in the process of being evaluated in the preclinical or the clinical stages, and industry now seems quite willing to do more sharing about that information so that we can focus the efforts on the ones that are going to be most likely to succeed. We need biomarkers that would be able to actually distinguish different kinds of pain in different populations, because the treatment for one kind of pain may be very different than another, and we do too much lumping right now of pain syndromes. And biomarkers that could actually predict clinical outcomes to a particular therapy. We need objective measurements of pain, what we would call a pain-o-meter, instead of the very long in place but not all that useful 1 to 10 scale. And we need a clinical trial network that enables testing of novel treatments for specific high-impact pain conditions that we could use as a means of rapid assessment and ultimately FDA approval of successful interventions. Again, it has been a real pleasure working with my colleagues in industry, and it's been all hands on deck for the last several months in this space. And we are now very close to being able to see exactly what this network could look like. FDA will be a big part of this as well, and that's a very wonderful thing, and Scott Gottlieb has a lot to be thanked for that. But we need the expertise of everybody in this room. I'm thrilled there are companies represented here we're going to hear from that have some very creative ideas. We can do this. It's not going to happen overnight, but if we put every bit of this energy, we can accelerate the pace. We can take things that might have taken many years and cut that time in half. And some of these efforts, particularly improving medication-assisted treatment options, could actually be done fairly quickly. So thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Collins. Appreciate it. Any members of the commission have any questions for Dr. Collins? You can have an opportunity later as well, but if anyone has one now. All right, if not, I want to acknowledge the presence of Secretary Shulkin. The true test of whether we like you or not is what we say when you're not in the room. So before you arrived, Secretary, I just talked about my visit along with Congressman Kennedy and Kellyanne Conway to the Lewis Stokes Hospital in Cleveland, and what an extraordinarily eye-opening experience it was, and how proud we all are, and I know you rightfully are, for the efforts that they're making and the results they're providing for veterans. And we hope that not only we know you're already working on scaling that across the VA system, we hope it can provide some real insight and inspiration for medical providers all across the country. So we really thank you for being here, and if you have any remarks you'd like to make, I invite you to do so.
It's not New Jersey, but Cleveland does a pretty good job.
It's okay.
So, thanks.
See, this is a smart cabinet secretary. I next want to turn to Steve Ubel, the president and CEO of Pharma, and thank Steve first off for helping us to set up the meeting that Dr. Collins referenced in his remarks a week ago in Trenton, where we had more than a dozen CEOs and senior executives of pharmaceutical companies from all over the country come to Trenton and speak to us and agree to enter into a partnership with NIH and the FDA to move on those two areas that Dr. Collins referenced. So I appreciate Steve's hard work in making that happen, and welcome him here today as part of the testimony. So Steve, welcome, and thank you for coming back.
Well, thank you, Governor Christie. I think it's clear to anyone who's observed your leadership and the work of the commission that President Trump and the administration are committed to achieving a maximum impact on this national, multifaceted public health crisis. And candidly, you've inspired the leaders of America's biopharmaceutical companies and our membership to do all we can to support your efforts. I really just want to make 3 points today. First, picking up on Dr. Collins's comments, we're very excited to bring the best and brightest researchers in our companies, not just companies in the opioid space, but all of our members to bear with NIH, FDA, and other stakeholders in the new groundbreaking public-private partnership that Dr. Collins mentioned. As he said, there are really 2 aims of the partnership. One is to speed patient access to non-opioid alternatives. Our member companies have more than 40 compounds in the pipeline. But 2, modify existing treatments, whether it's greater potency of overdose reversal agents or longer duration medication-assisted treatments. We think there are improvements that can be made in the very short term. As Dr. Collins mentioned, our companies are prepared to collaborate, break down silos, improve communication to really move the needle. The second point I want to make is that many of the proactive policies that Pharma supports are included in the interim report. We support enhancing law enforcement capacity to stop the flow of counterfeit fentanyl and other illicit drugs. We applaud Dr. Gottlieb at FDA for his recent efforts to crack down on rogue online pharmacies. We support mandatory annual prescriber training for pain management, and we support strengthening prescription drug monitoring programs at the federal and state level. As you know, these databases can monitor prescribing behavior and have been shown to limit overprescribing. Third, today Pharma is announcing for the first time our support to limit the supply of opioids to 7 days for acute pain management. Too often, individuals receive a 30-day supply of opioid medicines for minor treatments or short-term pain. Overprescribing and dispensing can lead to patients taking opioids longer than necessary and excess pills falling into the wrong hands. Our announcement is candidly an unprecedented step for the industry. We've always supported physician autonomy and the preservation of the physician-patient relationship, but as you know, given the scope of this crisis, we believe it's the right thing to do. In closing, I'd like to make a final point, sort of a cautionary note, that we can make progress on all of the items that we're discussing here today, but they could be undermined if we don't address insurance coverage barriers to things like mental health services, non-opioid treatment options, medication-assisted treatments, and other services. So in closing, as I said in Trenton, the researchers and scientists who work for our companies wake up every day with the sole goal of improving the human condition. And we want to bring all of our talents to bear to help you solve this problem.
Well, Steve,
Thank
thank you very much for your remarks, and I want to thank you for and the industry for stepping forward and coming to the table with the beginnings of limits on initial prescriptions for acute pain. It's really important. As you know, the states, many of the states have gone to where you're saying today or even further. I think we need to have continued conversation about that to make sure that we limit, and we were talking earlier today about the fact that this is a prevention measure as much as it is anything else, to limit the number of drugs that are out there for improper diversion and to make sure that we don't turn people inadvertently into addicts by giving 30, 60, 90 pills in their first time. And so the fact that the pharmaceutical industry is willing to step up and acknowledge that there's something that needs to be done here on that is an important first step, and we appreciate you taking that first step and here today, and look forward to working with you on future steps to try to limit the amount of these drugs that are out there that can be used inappropriately. All right. Now we're going to go to the testimony of our invited organizations. These are companies across the spectrum in the biopharmaceutical world. A number of them I've gotten to meet and talk to personally over time. I appreciate all of you being here today. I looked at the order in which we have the folks listed on the agenda. I have no idea how we picked this order. I was trying to figure it out for myself. It seems to be not organized in any particular way. So I'm not gonna give it any importance other than to say I might as well do that so at least I can keep track of everybody who's speaking today. But first I want to introduce James Campbell, who is the Chief Scientific Officer of Centrexion Therapeutics. We're going to give each one of these folks 5 minutes to kind of make a presentation, and then after all of them are done, we'll let the commissioners come back then and be able to ask questions to any of the folks that are on the panel. Of course, they're commissioners on a presidential commission, so if they feel completely compelled to interrupt at some point, we're not going to give them, as Shulkin would call it, the Jersey treatment. So, Dr. Campbell, why don't you begin?
I'm over here.
Yep.
And it's a pleasure to get things started here. Governor Christie, members of the commission, my name is Dr. Jim Campbell, and I am here to represent Centrexion Therapeutics, a Boston-based biotechnology company whose sole mission is to develop novel, non-opioid, non-addictive therapeutics for the treatment of chronic pain. In addition to serving as president of Centrexion, I am professor emeritus of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. I was previously president of the American Pain Society, and I've published over 100 peer-reviewed scientific studies in the field of pain research. As we develop strategies to deal with the opioid crisis, it is imperative that we understand that one of the major factors leading to this crisis is chronic pain itself. The treatment of pain in America is a major public health issue. Current treatments are inadequate, and one of the consequences, the overuse of opioids, is deadly. I made the jump from Hopkins to industry because I believe we can do better. I am here today to tell you that our nation needs a moonshot commitment to the development of non-opioid pain treatments. We need new therapies, and we need them fast. The abuse of opioids costs lives, but other equally important issue is the problem of untreated pain. Untreated pain leads to lost work, depression, lack of sleep, social withdrawal, and may even lead to suicide. At Centrexion, we are working earnestly to address the problem of chronic pain. From our inception just 4 years ago, Centrexion has developed a promising and comprehensive pipeline of 6 different non-opioid, non-addictive treatments. Our experience has made it clear to us that there are 3 opportunities, if you will, to foster development of new treatments. And I'd like to briefly bring up each of these. They are the business environment, the regulatory environment, and finally, the reimbursement environment. A substantial barrier to the development of novel pain treatments is the widespread, though we believe largely inaccurate, perception that this kind of drug development has a higher risk of failure than is seen in other therapeutic areas. Given a perception that investigational pain products are subject to a disproportionate number of regulatory failures, investors see our area is unfavorable for investment. And as we all know, in our capital system, investment follows economic opportunity and regulatory predictability. This brings me to my next area of concern, and that is the regulatory environment. One of the biggest barriers for the advancement of new therapies is the lack of an adequately resourced analgesia division at the FDA, in our view. A better resourced division will lead to more efficient and timely reviews. In addition, we wish to offer 3 specific recommendations that have proven successful in advancing development in other therapeutic areas. The first of these is to create a non-opioid drug priority review voucher to reward sponsors of new non-opioid pain therapies. Number 2 is to allow waivers of FDA filing fees for new non-opioid treatments. And finally, number 3, provide significant tax credits for investment in new non-opioid drug clinical development. In addition, other FDA mechanisms can be adapted to prioritize the development of better therapies. For example, create a non-opioid drug designation, grant 10-year market exclusivity to new non-opioid treatments, similar to what has been done with the orphan drug designation. Mandate breakthrough status to novel non-opioid treatments. Designating new therapies as a breakthrough category would substantially enhance the prospect for investment and successful development, in our view. And this brings me to my final risk factor, and that is what has already been brought up very briefly, and that is the reimbursement environment. There was a front page story in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago, and I want to quote briefly from this. At a time when the United States is in the grip of an opioid epidemic, many insurers are limiting access to pain medications that carry a lower risk of addiction or dependence. Payers often implement barriers to the use of branded on-label non-opioid medicines, relegating these treatments to second-line options. The result is a gateway to abuse and addiction, and it reinforces a prevailing no-go attitude among investors. In conclusion, a critical element of a successful strategy to combat the opioid crisis is to promote the development of much-needed non-opioid pain treatments. Centrexion looks forward to playing our part in advancing public policy solutions that will bring more approved, safe, and effective therapies to patients. Thank you.
Dr. Campbell, thank you. Thank you for your thoughtful testimony, and thank you for being here today, and we'll be opening up to questions after we hear from everyone else, but thank you very much. Next, we'll go to Christian Kopfli, who is the CEO of Chromacell Corporation. Christian, welcome, and we welcome your remarks.
Thank you. Governor Christie and members of the Commission, thank you very much for having us here. It is an honor for all us to participate in this national effort to combat the opioid crisis. Chromacell is a New Jersey-based biotech company committed to the development of a completely novel class of non-addictive drugs. These therapies are expected to have no mood-altering effects, no abuse potential, and therefore may well become an alternative to opioids. There's increasing evidence that a substantial portion of the deaths occurring in this crisis are a result of addiction to opioids that were originally prescribed to patients to alleviate their severe pain. Despite decades of research, no really effective new therapeutic alternative to opioids have become available. Therefore, a significant driver of the crisis is the lack of alternative to opioids. In addition, payers in some instances prefer cheaper opioid pain medications over non-addiction forming pain relievers. At Chromocell, our mission is to address this driver of the crisis by developing novel pain drugs that are highly effective but non-addictive. After a decade of research, we feel that we are at the forefront of development of medication that target a new class of pain receptors. This approach is different from other pain therapies by its unique mechanism of action. These drugs work by specifically targeting a protein on nerves that carry the sensation of pain to the brain, known as sodium channel NaV1.7. Interestingly, the discovery of this target came about by investigating patients who were born without the ability to feel pain. It has been shown that in these patients, the NaV1.7 channel is underactive. We expect that by blocking the NaV1.7 channel with our novel pain drug in patients with pain syndromes, their overactive channels will be restored to normal activity, and a significant reduction of pain could be accomplished. The exciting characteristics in that this approach does not involve the opioid receptor system. Our drug candidate does not appear to penetrate into the brain, decreasing the probability for addiction because the patient will not experience mood alteration. In addition, drugs that have less specific and broad NaV activity, like the analgesic lidocaine, are known to have no addiction liability or mood-altering effects. Our drug candidate is intended to treat various chronic pain conditions for which opioids are widely prescribed, including pain from nerve damage by diabetes and cancer treatments, osteoarthritis, and lower back pain. Excitingly, we are in clinical trials. In mid-2018, we will go into a global phase 2 study to investigate the efficacy and safety in a rare painful condition resulting from nerve damage. If our drug candidate works as expected, it will allow many patients to live with less pain and without the risk of becoming addicted to opioids. This would be a major breakthrough. It would help to prevent addiction in the first place by avoiding the prescription of opioids. We're also developing therapeutics to address the use of opioids in the treatment of pain after surgery, since this is a potential gateway to opioid addiction as well. In order to shut off this potential pathway, we are creating an intravenous form of our medication for hospital and surgical use. Our industry faces financial and regulatory challenges in bringing its non-opioid innovations to patients suffering from pain. These patients are at risk to become the next victims of the crisis without medical innovations. We therefore firmly support the recent effort of the Commission, the NIH, and the FDA to create a public-private partnership to address this crisis, including the development of new non-addictive pain therapies. We are hoping that the Commission will accelerate this proposal and provide the means to further these efforts. To enable lasting solutions in the field and make sustainable progress, we have the following 3 recommendations. First, long-term solutions. Putting a strong focus on the development of sustainable long-term solutions that address one of the root causes of the crisis, the absence of effective non-addictive pain medications. While short-term and preventive measures are critically important, we must not lose sight on resolving the underlying cause for the current challenge. Second, public-private partnership. Accelerate the development of this novel class of pain drugs through the public-private partnership to make them accessible to patients as soon as possible. Potential areas, as Dr. Collins mentioned, for collaboration are the development of biomarkers, data sharing between the parties, establishing of a pain trials network, and others. We and our industry are ready and committed to support these efforts. Third, regulatory. Support the FDA efforts to closely work with biotech and pharmaceutical companies to enable clinical trials of novel non-addictive pain drugs to proceed as fast as possible. Also support the availability of non-addictive intravenous solutions to minimize the risk of dependency after surgeries. Governor Christie and Commission members, we deeply appreciate your leadership in addressing this crisis. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important effort.
Christian, thank you very much. And Appreciate your remarks and look forward to having some questions later on. Next, we'll go to David Stack. David is the CEO and Chairman of Pacira Pharmaceuticals. David was with us last week, and we welcome you back this week.
Thank you, Governor. Governor Christie and members of the Commission, thank you for inviting me to testify today on how changes to Medicare reimbursement policy and FDA drug approval frameworks can help stop the opioid addiction before it starts. My name is Dave Stack, and I'm the CEO of Pacira Pharmaceuticals. Pacira was incorporated in 2006 for the main purpose of developing Exparel, a non-opioid drug used with our depot foam technology that is currently approved for single-dose infiltration into the surgical site for the management of post-surgical pain. When injected into the surgical site during a procedure, Exparel numbs the local area of the surgery for several days. In clinical studies, Exparel has greatly reduced, or in some cases, eliminated the need for opioids. Pacira's corporate mission is to drive innovation in post-surgical pain management to provide an opioid alternative to as many patients as possible. To date, more than 3 million patients in the United States have been treated with Exparel. Given this mission, our company has followed the Commission's work with great interest and congratulates the Commission for developing the thoughtful and well-researched recommendations contained in the interim report. To complement the recommendations, I would like to bring your attention to the need to address a key contributor to the opioid epidemic, the prescription and use of opioids for the treatment of post-surgical pain. Evidence shows that the adoption of alternative pain management strategies, which utilize non-opioid medications, can effectively manage patients' post-surgical pain while reducing or eliminating opioid consumption. The technology is available today. Yet the current reimbursement policies implemented by CMS are making it difficult for hospitals and ambulatory surgery centers to adopt these strategies. As the Commission recognizes, more than 91 Americans die each day from an opioid overdose. It is well established that the operating room is the gateway to opioid addiction. Recent studies demonstrate that nearly 1 in 10 surgical patients in the United States continues to use opioids 3 to 6 months after surgery, transitioning approximately 3 million opioid-naive individuals to persistent opioid use following surgery each year. Moreover, the prescription use of opioids for surgical patients creates a reservoir of unused opioids that fuels addiction. One study found that as much as 71% of dispensed opioids go unused. In fact, over 50% of people who misuse opioids report obtaining them from family or friends for free, indicating that the diversion of excess prescribed opioid pills is a major contributor to the perpetuation of opioid addiction. Products like Exparel have proven to effectively treat post-surgical pain while reducing opioid consumption in a variety of surgical procedures. In a recent study of the use of Exparel as part of a multimodal pain management protocol for patients undergoing total knee replacement, the Exparel group showed a 78% reduction in opioid consumption compared to the control group, while providing a statistically significant improvement in pain control. Importantly, opioids were not part of the protocol in this study, but rather were used as a rescue medication, which allowed 10% of the patients in the Exparel group to remain completely opioid-free, compared to 0 in the control group. This is a particularly important result for patients at high risk or in recovery for opioid addiction, and for whom any exposure to opioids is particularly dangerous. Thus, drugs like Exparel have an important role to play in ensuring that post-surgical pain treatment does not continue to fuel the national opioid epidemic. Although multimodal pain strategies have been proven to reduce the use of opioids while providing effective post-surgical pain relief and a better patient experience, there are current policies in place that effectively impede the adoption of these strategies, causing them to remain underutilized among healthcare providers in the United States. By changing these policies, government decision makers can make an immediate contribution to combating the opioid epidemic. Specifically, the current CMS Medicare packaging policy, adopted in 2015, bundled any item used during surgery into the fixed surgical payment as a surgical supply. Drugs like Exparel are not reimbursed separately, but payment is considered to be bundled into this fixed payment simply because the drugs are administered during the surgery, despite the fact that this administration is intended to manage post-surgical pain. This means that hospitals and ambulatory surgery centers receive the same fixed fee from Medicare, whether the surgeon administers a non-opioid medication or not. This payment policy created a perverse incentive for hospitals and ambulatory surgery centers by essentially rewarding those that prescribed opioids instead of administering a non-opioid pain medication. The provider bears expense associated with using Exparel, but because the provider purchases and administers the drug. However, the provider bears no expense for prescribing an oral opioid that the patient picks up from the pharmacy, despite the steep societal costs. Thus, as an unintended consequence, Current Medicare policy significantly restricts the ability of hospitals and ambulatory surgery centers to provide patients with non-opioid pain management options due to inadequate reimbursement. Since commercial payers often set their reimbursement based on Medicare reimbursement, this is a widespread issue. Not surprisingly then, the adoption of opioid-reducing pain management strategies in the United States has remained limited. The majority of hospitals in the U.S. today have no strategy or plan for opioid minimization, and few have a protocol for surgical care of patients in recovery who desperately require opioid-free surgery. And today, there are over 20 million Americans in recovery for addiction. To complement the recommendations set out in the Commission's interim report for improving the federal response to drug addiction and opioid crisis, we propose 3 federal policy changes. These are intended to amend current policies that are acting as effective barriers to the use of non-opioid medications as part of evidence-based multimodal pain management strategies, and to expedite the development and approval of non-opioid treatments, particularly for patients with special needs. First, unbundle Medicare reimbursement for non-opioid drugs administered by healthcare providers as part of a multimodal post-surgical pain management strategy while establishing separate recognition and reimbursement for those drugs. Turning off the flow of new persistent opioid users will be a significant step in addressing the crisis in our country today. Second, establish a new Medicare HCPCS code to reimburse healthcare practitioners for additional time needed to provide pre- and post-surgical evaluations and educational consultations related to low or no opioid post-surgical pain management strategies. And third, adopt expedited development and review pathways for FDA approval of new non-opioid analgesics, and as well as supplements for approved non-opioid analgesics for acute pain. Particular attention should be paid to patient subgroups with unmet medical need for non-opioid pain medications, such as pediatric patients who currently have no approved alternative to opioids for severe post-surgical pain management. The opioid epidemic is a multi-source problem, and it will take multi-pronged response. Given the data showing the frequency with which the use of opioids for post-surgical pain management results in persistent opioid use, particularly among patients with heightened risk factors, and the large number of patients in recovery for whom the use of opioids is particularly dangerous, it is important that this multi-pronged response includes steps to reduce reliance on opioids for the treatment of post-surgical pain. The recommendations proposed in this testimony are designed for that purpose and to provide actionable steps which can be taken immediately to reduce the burden of the national opioid epidemic. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I welcome the opportunity to answer any questions. Thank you, Governor.
David, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Next, we have Mike Durkas, who is the president and CEO of Braeburn Pharmaceuticals. Mike, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Governor Christie, and members of the commission. It's an honor to be here today, and thanks for the opportunity to really discuss an incredibly critical issue. This opioid addiction crisis is a crisis really that this country has never dealt with before, and it really does require all hands on deck to make a dent and make a profound difference. As the father of 4 young teenage boys, I am deeply passionate, and hairless as well, but deeply passionate about finding solutions to this serious crisis. In fact, Braeburn is a company that's exclusively dedicated to finding solutions and delivering those solutions to the patients that deal with the serious, often fatal consequences of opioid addiction. So Braeburn is really focused on the part of the problem, which is treatment. We believe that those who suffer from addiction and the healthcare professionals who treat them will greatly benefit from the expansion of treatment options and improved access to medication-assisted therapy. This disease, just like any other disease, requires individualized treatment plans, and those treatment plans should be decided between a healthcare provider and a patient. Braeburn is committed to expanding options which are desperately needed for these patients and is working diligently to create additional solutions for healthcare providers. Last week, the FDA granted priority review to our new drug application for CAM 2038, our treatment for opioid use disorder. CAM 2038 depot injections are designed to provide individualized treatment from initiation and stabilization through to longer-term maintenance therapy, providing sustained buprenorphine release in a once-weekly and once-monthly formulation. The CAM products, if approved, will be administered by healthcare professionals to ensure proper delivery, medication adherence, and potentially minimizing risks of diversion, misuse, and accidental pediatric exposure. The other side of the coin of this issue is pain management. And as was mentioned earlier, according to the NIH, 25 million Americans suffer from daily chronic pain. Currently, CAM 2038 is undergoing phase 3 clinical studies to test its safety and efficacy to treat chronic pain. As I have described today, and others have testified before me, this is a complex problem. It is a problem that will only be solved when regulatory bodies create a space that doesn't include barriers to patients getting the treatment they need when they need it. SAMHSA estimated that in 2016, 10.6 million patients or people misused opioids in the U.S., and only 1.2 million people were treated. Our treatment rates are dreadfully low, and it is leading to an unacceptably high death rate. We need to tear down these barriers that are preventing patients from getting access to treatment. And until we make it as easy to get treatment as it is to get illicit drugs in this country, the epidemic will continue. I am encouraged to see that the Commission's interim recommendations included important policies that would help ensure patients could access treatments and the care they need when they need it. For instance, the Commission recommended the enforcement of the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act. Finally, I want to recognize that the payers are our partners in helping to fight this epidemic. I want to applaud the major insurance companies that have recently announced that they were ending the pre-authorization requirements on all buprenorphine products used to treat opioid addiction. We agree that these companies, that ending these requirements will truly increase access to treatment of opioid use disorder. In closing, let me thank the Commission again for its tireless work and dedicated efforts on this issue. Those of us working in the field can agree it often seems like an insurmountable problem, but we also know that through scientific research and innovation, we can give our healthcare professionals the resources they so badly need. Braeburn is proud to be part of the solution, and we look forward to working with the Commission and many others to put an end to this epidemic and save American lives. Thank you.
Mike, thank you. Appreciate it very much. Appreciate your thoughtful testimony. Look forward to questions later. Next, I want to introduce Dr. George Savage. He is the Chief Medical Officer for Proteus Digital Health. George, welcome. Look forward to your testimony.
Governor Christie, members of the Commission, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you all today. I'm Dr. George Savage. I'm the co-founder and Chief Medical Officer of Proteus Digital Health. I've been working in Silicon Valley for 30 years now, almost 30 years, as a medical technology entrepreneur. My colleagues at Proteus and I are very grateful for the work this Commission and our medical leaders are doing to really combat opioid abuse and dependency in America. It's encouraging that we're already starting to see changes in how these powerful drugs are being prescribed. As we're all aware, CVS last week announced a policy of limiting many opioid prescriptions. As I just learned earlier this morning, pharma is now endorsing that. These are very positive steps to solving this crisis. However, many of our patients need these drugs and they're critical, so we have to strike the right balance between restriction and appropriate access. I applaud the focus today on innovative approaches and the work my colleagues here are doing on new drugs. However, some of these technologies don't fit naturally into traditional medical categories, and so it may be that some out-of-the-box thinking spearheaded by this Commission will help us turn the tide. Fortunately, from a technology perspective, we've reached a point in society where new sensors, new software, and new mobile devices, phones and such, are really supercharging medicine in unprecedented ways. At my company, Proteus, we've developed a platform built on these technologies that allows your medicine, when you swallow it, to automatically talk to your cell phone after it's been swallowed. We call these products digital medicines. They've already been used in thousands of patients with positive outcomes and excellent safety results reported in the peer-reviewed literature. Here's how it works. A mobile app displays for you and your doctor how your medicines are actually being taken. You can also display measures such as your heart rate, your rest, and your activity and other metrics. Your doctor can use data analytics to determine whether you or other patients under his or her care need extra attention. Policymakers can also benefit from these data flows. For instance, instead of regulators waiting years for data to come in to gauge the performance of a marketed drug, with digital medicine, you can see real-world data immediately and on every patient. Any medicine can be made digital by associating it with an FDA-approved sensor that is the size of a grain of sand. This ingestible sensor is in commercial use today at a limited number of healthcare systems. For widespread use, however, the digital sensor has to be built into medicines at the factory. In this case, further FDA approval is required. The first such product, developed by Proteus and Otsuka Pharmaceuticals, is under review by FDA right now. This digital medicine is intended to treat serious mental illness, which, as you all know, is associated with drug abuse in the majority of patients. We have an open software platform and are actively collaborating with universities and NIH to explore a variety of applications. In fact, 3 NIH-funded clinical studies are underway right now evaluating how digital medicines may help improve HIV management. Proteus is planning to formulate a digital opioid and take it through the FDA approval process. A digital opioid will give your doctor the ability for the first time to dynamically measure pain, allowing new insights and better treatment decisions. Our medical advisors tell us that this product could help ensure that the right dose of the right medicine reaches the right patient at the right time and for the proper duration. This is of particular importance in the treatment of severe chronic pain, such as that experienced by many cancer patients, those with sickle cell disease, and others, and it could also be used in medication-assisted therapy for those with addiction problems. A key point, every tablet, every sensor is programmed with its own serial number. This means that pills can be tracked at the individual pill level, which should serve to detect and deter diversion. As with many of my colleagues, I have 3 recommendations that it would be useful for the government to help realize the promise of this technology that I'd like the Commission to consider. The first, FDA leadership should clarify that these new innovations like digital medicine fall under the existing definition of an abuse deterrent formulation. That's essential for approval. Secondly, FDA should consider granting priority review to novel opioid and non-opioid solutions that are designed to deter and reduce abuse. This will compress the target review time from 10 to 6 months. Third, CMS and private payers should swiftly create and value codes to reimburse physicians for the resources they need to expend to realize the benefits of these technologies. In summary, we should use all available policy levers to address this problem, prevent new addiction, reduce opioid abuse, and help improve pain management. Objective data from digital medicines can help addressing both the trust gap we often note between patients and physicians who are dealing with pain medicine, and also optimizing therapy while preventing abuse and deterring diversion. Finally, a few adjustments in public policy will accelerate the rate at which new innovations like digital medicines can reach those suffering from severe pain. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Savage, very much. Professor Madras has a question for you.
Yes, I wonder if the technology can be applied to naloxone, and in order to monitor and alert a first responder of use and record and document.
Yeah, the technology currently is aimed at oral formulations. This communication technology that we have with the sensor, it's designed to be ingestible. It can be adapted to injectables such as naloxone, but we haven't done that as yet.
Thank you, appreciate it. Dr. Savage, once again, thank you for your time and for the really interesting testimony. We appreciate it. Next, we'll go to Corey McCann. Corey is the founder and CEO of Pear Therapeutics. We appreciate you taking the time to be here. We look forward to your testimony. Corey.
Wonderful. Thank you, Governor Christie. Thank you to the Commission. I am Corey McCann. Once again, I am the founder and chief executive officer of Pear Therapeutics. Pear is creating a new idea, which is the prescription digital therapeutic. Just to unpack this, this is a piece of software like an app that is prescribed by your physician to treat a disease, and the patient participates with this piece of software, and it treats the disease much like a new pharmaceutical product. The company, Pear, has built up a whole portfolio of these products, and we develop them much like new pharmaceutical preparations. You may have seen just about 2 weeks ago, Pear Therapeutics received the first ever FDA-approved digital therapeutic. This is our product called Reset. And this product, much like a traditional pharmaceutical product, was run through a set of randomized clinical studies that demonstrated a statistically significant enhancement of rates of abstinence for patients who were suffering from addiction to alcohol, cocaine, cannabis, and stimulants. Just to give you a sense for the overall magnitude of the effect that was seen, about 40% of the patients who received the digital therapeutic displayed abstinent behaviors at the end of the clinical study, and about 20% of patients who did not receive the digital therapy and who received the best-of-breed face-to-face care hit the primary endpoint, which was abstinence in this study. You don't often see doubling of a primary approvable endpoint, and so this is, for us, very much a watershed moment for the company, but also for the space. Once again, this was the first time that the agency has ever cleared any piece of software to treat any disease, and we are poised now to bring these prescription digital therapeutics to patients and ultimately to do this across a portfolio. I just spoke to Reset, which omits opioids as one of the substances of abuse in the clinical study, but we have a subsequent product called Reset-O, which is designed to be used in combination with medicated assisted therapy, like buprenorphine, like methadone, and has similarly glowing data to, again, enhance rates of abstinence. Before I move forward, I just want to flag this as really a victory for public policy. This approval for Reset represents about a 2-year conversation with the agency, and I want to applaud them for thinking about an entirely new modality of therapeutic product and for really working in order to bring this set of products to patients. This also represents a tremendous collaboration with the National Institute of Drug Abuse. A great deal of the clinical data which was submitted in the Reset approval package came from studies that were funded by NIDA. So here I am really functioning primarily in the purpose of generating awareness. This is obviously a new product category. It's an entirely new way of treating this set of patients. But once again, these efficacy numbers are eye-watering, and really this has the opportunity to redefine standard of care. So like most of the other folks here at the Commission, I'd like to ask for 3 things. Number 1, I'd like to ask for the Commission's willingness and partnership in generating awareness amongst clinicians within the VA health system that digital therapeutics are a new standard in efficacy for this set of patients. Number 2, I would like to engage the Commission in fighting for much of the work that's already been accomplished in really viewing mental health conditions and addiction conditions on par with physical health conditions and driving toward reimbursement for that set of conditions as per the Mental Health Parity Act. And then number 3, you've heard a reimbursement component across many of the speakers this morning. We, like everyone else at the table, are actively engaging third-party payers. We are actively engaging CMS, and we are once again very committed to bringing these technologies to patients to again completely reset the standard of care for substance use disorder and opiate use disorder. So in conclusion, I would once again like to thank the Commission and would welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Corey. Appreciate it. It's exciting news, and congratulations on that as well. Next, we're going to go to Richard Pops. Richard is the CEO of Alkermes. And Richard, glad to see you again, and I look forward to hearing your testimony.
Were you ready for science class today, Governor?
Yeah, never was, but we're getting better at it every day.
So
I became a lawyer, buddy.
Let me add my thanks for the invitation, and thanks to the Commission for your great work, and also thanks to the White House for their consistent work in this field as well. I have 2 points I want to bring up. Our company's been on the front lines of fighting this epidemic for the last 10 years or so, and we have got all the scars to show for it. There's 2 specific points I want to make today on the topic of diversion in particular. One relates to Vivitrol, which is an FDA-approved medicine without diversion issues. And the second relates to new science that is related to the treatment of a particular form of pain, depression, which is psychic pain, and a medicine that we have in development with the potential to avoid diversion issues associated with the traditional opioids. So our company, we're a biotechnology company. We have about 2,000 people. We develop medications specifically for the treatment of serious mental illness and addiction. We do really serious science, advanced science, in really difficult clinical settings. One of the medications we're most proud of is Vivitrol. So Vivitrol is a once-monthly injection. It's non-addictive, it's non-narcotic, and it's approved for the prevention of relapse to opioid dependence following opioid detoxification. There are 2 unique features of Vivitrol that make it so interesting and why it's not diverted, traded, or sold illicitly on the street. The first is that it's not an opioid. It doesn't cause a high, and it's not abused. That's because pharmacologically, Vivitrol is an opiate receptor antagonist. It binds to the brain's receptors and completely blocks the effects of the opioids. But secondly, it's also a long-acting preparation, a long-acting injection. A single treatment with Vivitrol provides therapeutic concentrations of the medicine for up to a month. So the benefits of long-acting injectables go simply beyond assuring that you have therapeutic concentrations for a month. They give the professional, the healthcare professional, the knowledge to have confidence that the patient is being taken, that the medication is being taken every day for that month period of time. So a month of medicine gives a patient a month to focus on other aspects of their treatment, their counseling, behavioral therapy, and things like that are critical to long-term outcomes. Then if the patient returns for another dose, they have another month. And then 2 months can become 3 months, and so on. This is important not only to healthcare professionals, but to family members and other members of the treatment team, including criminal justice care teams, because they're able to know with confidence whether or not the patient is taking the medicine and receiving the benefits of the medicine. And so while Vivitrol is the only medicine for opioid dependence with this trait today, others are in development that you've heard about, and that's a really good thing. The considerable benefits of these long-acting injectable preparations, which are called LAIs, long-acting injectables, come with unique challenges that the Commission can address. As the only company that's been fighting these fights for the last several years, we've got particular insights on the impediments and can offer a fair amount of help on that. Rather than going into the specifics today, I'll submit that to you as written testimony. But at the highest level of conceptualization, the idea is that insurance plans often treat these long-acting injectables in a way that makes reimbursement difficult, cumbersome, and uneconomic for providers. Multiple hurdles are enough to lead busy clinicians to throw up their hands and not engage in treatment despite having a sincere desire to help and adopt these new approaches. The current system is too cumbersome and uneconomic for the average treating physician, and that can change. That's a solvable problem. The other major issue / opportunity for the Commission relates to making sure that patients are aware of and have access to all FDA-approved medications. Each FDA-approved medication has an important role to play in the treatment of this epidemic, and no one medication is right for every single patient. The recently enacted CARA, Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act, which was enacted last year, reflects this treatment philosophy and provides that all healthcare practitioners must be able to provide access to all FDA-approved medications, either directly or by referral. It sounds so simple, but it's not the way things happen today. Today, it is the law of the land, and we support the immediate implementation of what's called Section 303 of the Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act of CARA. I just want to finish with a little bit more science on this last topic. This complex and poorly understood condition that's often at the core of both pain and addiction, and that's depression. Depression is psychic pain. The same brain circuits are activated in social rejection and these types of pain as in somatic pain or in physical pain. Nearly 2/3 of patients who take antidepressant medications fail to get adequate relief from them. And interestingly, a lot of them will take opioids and feel relief. So that in the same way that opioids are effective at treating physical pain, they can have this effect on psychic pain as well, but with the attendant risk that we're all aware of overdose and addiction and long-term consequences. And there's a growing and I think underappreciated literature now that shows a connection between the current epidemic and inadequately treated depression. So we have a medicine that we're just about to file for FDA approval for, a new non-addictive medicine that, if it's approved, would be an important tool in this. And if we're approved, it addresses these two public health issues, the huge public health issue of untreated or insufficiently treated depression, while at the same time, some of the strong underlying causes for opioid abuse in the country. So I'll finish there and thank you very much.
Richard, thank you. Appreciate that a great deal, and look forward to questions coming up. Pani Subbiah, the Chief Medical Officer of Indivior, is here as well. Welcome, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Governor. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Poni Subaya. I'm a neurologist and chief medical officer at Indivior. Thank you for the privilege to address the commission. Indivior is a specialty pharmaceutical company, and our core focus is addiction medicine. So we have a 20-year legacy in clinical and basic research, treatment development, health policy, and patient advocacy, including partnering with NIH and NIDA to develop the first buprenorphine-based treatment for opioid use disorder. So today, we have a global portfolio of opioid disorder treatments and a pipeline to address unmet patient needs. As we've heard, millions of patients suffer from addiction, but many are not aware that addiction is a disease that can't be medically treated. Access to treatment, however, remains limited, and currently only about 10% of people with a substance use disorder receive treatment. Clinical evidence has repeatedly verified that medication-assisted treatments, such as buprenorphine, methadone, naltrexone, along with counseling and psychosocial support, are effective in treating patients affected by the dependence. However, patients face numerous barriers to treatment that this commission can actively address and reduce. Now, the patient journey, as we all know, is complex, especially in this disease. Social stigma, prejudice, and misconceptions about addiction, coupled with feelings of guilt and shame, often prevent people from seeking help. Addiction is also punished and criminalized. Even when people want to stop using illicit drugs, cravings and withdrawal symptoms can be so intense that generally there's only a small window of time when a person is emotionally, physically able to pursue treatment. The healthcare system, however, does not always allow treatment during that window due to structural barriers to care. Thus, the majority of those who need help go untreated. But even for those people who do take action, there are obstacles to access treatment. Prescribers of evidence-based buprenorphine treatments are often a scarce resource. Right now, there are more than 40,000 waivered healthcare providers that are able to prescribe buprenorphine-based treatments, but only about half actually are actively prescribing, and many of them are treating less than the number of patients that are permitted by federal law. Further, most providers are concentrated in urban areas, resulting in treatment deserts for those that are in rural communities, an important point that we need to keep in mind. Challenges, however, continue for patients once they are in treatment. Patients have difficulty adhering to treatment plans when they're confronted with relapse because it is a chronic, relapsing medical condition. Affordability and lack of coverage for treatment, including those suggested by several other speakers, including proposed limits on the treatment dose and duration, restrictions on treatment choice, and required prior authorization, result in suboptimal disease management. And adding to that, well-intended families, friends, and communities pressure patients to stop taking addiction medicine because there's misconceptions both about the disease as well as the treatment. At Indivior, our product pipeline is focused on addressing unmet patient needs. So right now, we are developing a new investigational buprenorphine sustained-release formulation that's currently under review by the FDA. If approved, the medication would represent the first once-monthly injectable buprenorphine treatment for adults with moderate to severe opioid use disorder. This would be part of a complete treatment plan, which would include counseling and psychosocial support. Now, the science behind this medication expands the understanding of addiction mechanisms in the brain and offers a novel approach to treatment. The product aims to reduce the symptoms of both withdrawal and cravings, and also suppressing the effects of illicit opioids while trying to take it when the person's on the medication. As an injectable formulation that is administered by healthcare professionals, the product uses a delivery system that's intended to enhance adherence and make abuse and diversion difficult. The FDA stated PDUFA date is November 30th, 2017, and if it is approved, we believe the medication has the potential to transform treatment for patients. However, as we all know, MATs aren't a solution by themselves. They need to be paired with appropriate policies that can accelerate solutions to this crisis. So we have outlined several in our written testimony, but I want to highlight a few very important ones. First, and I feel very strongly at that, especially as a clinician, we need to end the stigma of addiction. People with substance use disorders are not addicts or criminals who deserve to be punished. They are patients, and they deserve to be treated. Second, we should do more to accelerate and expand access to all evidence-based treatments, like my colleague mentioned. And any ambiguity in the current distribution laws should be addressed for new product innovations. Third, it is important that we continue to enforce and comply with the Mental Health and Substance Use Disorder Parity Act, and require plans to demonstrate compliance as a condition of approval, and also ensure patients and families are fully informed of their rights under the Act. Finally, very importantly, no one who overdoses should ever leave a hospital emergency department without a pathway to treatment and a recovery plan for this disease. We should ensure evidence-based protocols and training at this key intervention point. This is a huge opportunity that we need to address. All of us together can transform addiction from a human crisis to a recognized and highly treated disease. It has been done before. We can do it again. Addiction is a disease. It can be treated one patient at a time. Patients are waiting, and we stand ready to support the Commission's work however we can. Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Appreciate your suggestions, and look forward to questions as well. Roger Crystal. Dr. Roger Crystal is the CEO of Opioid Pharmaceuticals. Roger, welcome. I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much. My name is Roger Crystal. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Opioid Pharmaceuticals. Governor Christie and the Commission, thank you very much for the invitation for our company to be here. We are honoured to be amongst distinguished industry leaders. Just to really give a personal and company perspective on the crisis overall, and I'd then like to talk about our company's efforts to address this crisis. My background, I come from the UK, and I started my career as a surgeon, and actually seeing firsthand the surgical complications of addiction and the devastation that causes really was what triggered me to go into research, go into this industry in order to look at how we can address it on a population level. And really the background I have also gives some perspective on the very different way in which pain is treated here compared to overseas. And it's somewhat striking that, and it was mentioned earlier, that here we treat with an opioid first and then consider potentially other forms of treatment for pain, whereas in my experience, and I did ENT surgery for a while, if I was to do a tonsillectomy on an adult, I'd perhaps start with acetaminophen, ibuprofen and ice cream, and then perhaps escalate up towards an opioid if the pain wasn't well managed. So even at this point, we're quite different, and this is where it's very encouraging, the remarks you made earlier around restricting opioid prescribing, but I think we can do more still, and that's something we'll probably discuss later as well. In terms of the notion of how we see addiction in this country, I'm very encouraged by the whole recognition as a disease, but again, we can really build on that. And Governor Christie, you mentioned at the last meeting about your mother and the fact that she wasn't stigmatized by having been a smoker and that causing lung cancer, yet, again, opioid addiction, for some reason, still being a disease, yet the complications are still stigmatized as well, and that's something we need to change. The efforts of our company, Opioid Pharmaceuticals, we're very proud of what we've achieved already, but more needs to be done. We were the company that developed the Narcan nasal spray. That went from concept to the point of FDA approval in 3 years, and that is licensed to our partner Adapt Pharmaceuticals, and they're doing a terrific job getting that out to people that need it. But as a company, our work here is not done. Opioid overdose in many ways represents the downstream, the ultimate devastating effects of opioid addiction, and we're now committed going upstream. We have 4 programs ongoing to address opioid use disorder. We're a dedicated company focusing on addiction. And today, in fact, we're announcing that we've started a collaboration with Titan Pharmaceuticals. They have a very FDA approved implant, and we have deep expertise in opioid antagonists, which Richard Pops mentioned earlier is the compound that blocks opioid receptors. We are going to be developing a 6-month opioid antagonist implant, and we're at a feasibility stage at the moment, and if that goes well, then we will look to take that into clinical trials shortly afterwards. And again, our premise is the same. We need to do things where we can bring effective medication into this crisis soon. Soon in the timeframe of drug development is within a few years rather than perhaps 10 to 15 years. We have an asset that might address something longer term. We have a heroin vaccine as well. But I don't want to spend too much time dwelling on that because that's not going to be something that can address the issues today. So we have hugely benefited, and we're very grateful for the public-private partnership that we've had with NIDA, with the Narcan nasal spray, and we are looking to perhaps get more of these types of partnerships as we move our programs forward as well. Again, the ask of us really hones in on just a couple of things. It's, in a sense, more of the same in terms of what we've heard from the Commission already, actually, and that is absolutely this relentless focus on the addiction, the model of addiction as a disease. If we get that right, then the second point should follow around more access to medical treatment. For me, again, the notion, even the term, dare I say, medical-assisted therapy or medical-assisted treatment is somewhat implying it's a supplementary or adjunct form of therapy, where really, again, the notion of being mainstream is what we really need to focus on. And then the public-private partnership experience we've had has been extremely beneficial. We've also had very good interactions with the FDA, and I welcome more of that. So more of this in terms of the government getting behind what we're trying to do so we can treat more patients in this terrible crisis. So thank you for the opportunity for being here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Roger. I appreciate it. And our final witness before we go to question and answer is Kristen Gulo. She's the Senior Director of U.S. World Meds. Kristen, thank you very much for being here. Look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Governor Christie, members. I'd like to thank this commission for its leadership in bringing renewed focus to evidence-based treatments in the fight against the opioid epidemic. I'm Kristen Gullo, and I lead development and regulatory affairs for U.S. World Meds, a Louisville-based specialty pharmaceutical company. For the past 12 years, I've directed the development efforts for our lead pipeline product, lofexidine. This work has been done in close collaboration with our partners at NIDA. Lofexidine, if approved by the FDA, would be the first and only non-narcotic product indicated in the treatment of opioid withdrawal. We've worked closely with the FDA, who granted us fast-track status, and just yesterday, we submitted our new drug application. We are now waiting for the agency's feedback on filing acceptance and our request for priority review. My colleagues and I believe withdrawal is an overlooked medical challenge, but it also represents an opportunity in the prevention, treatment, and recovery process for opioid use disorder. My own eye-opening education on the physical consequences of opioid use began when I started working with lofexidine. I learned the phrase cold turkey originated from the fact withdrawal chills can cause such an intensity of goosebumps that the human skin can look like the skin of a raw turkey. Kick the habit refers to leg thrashing that can be so violent it can cause bone fracture. Whether it was the post-surgery opioid user or someone in the throes of addiction, I've heard people describe their withdrawal experience like the cruelest virus you've ever had. Curled up on the bathroom floor, muscles cramping, sweating yet freezing at the same time, eyes and nose running, vomiting and diarrhea. It's ugly. It's sheer agony. And while a severe virus may last 12 hours, withdrawal persists for days, up to a week, sometimes longer. We need an improved withdrawal paradigm. I'm going to risk oversimplifying a very complex neurobiological process to stay within my designated time, but you all said you're up for a science lesson. Opioid use for as little as several days to a few weeks can cause physical dependence. This means that the brain has adjusted to the presence of the opioid to maintain normal operations. One of the results of the new equilibrium in the brain includes compensatory production of norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is a brain chemical that supports vital functions like respiration and consciousness. Opioids lower norepinephrine, and the brain reacts by increasing its production through other mechanisms, like a survival instinct. When the opioids are removed, the brain's increased norepinephrine levels are no longer offset by the presence of opioids, resulting in a neurochemical surge that causes the withdrawal symptoms. By now, I hope I've made 2 points. One, withdrawal is agony. And 2, it's a medical certainty. Now let's talk about the distinct challenges it presents to our current mission. When opioid withdrawal is misunderstood or undertreated, it can perpetuate opioid use beyond a clinical need or benefit. Also, overdose patients in the ER are in severe withdrawal, too often discharged with tools to manage it and leading them to seek their next fix. Finally, withdrawal represents a challenge to the initiation of other evidence-based therapies, such as the withdrawal that precipitates during transition from heroin to buprenorphine, or the prerequisite detoxification process for naltrexone initiation. Sorry about that. In today's world, we are counting overdoses and deaths. Think what might be possible if we could intercept people at the point of withdrawal and turn those counts into lives recovered. Our investigational product lofexidine suppresses the neurochemical surge associated with opioid withdrawal. In fact, in our clinical trials, patients reported less severe withdrawal symptoms and were more likely to complete a 7-day opioid discontinuation treatment, which is when withdrawal symptoms are expected to be the most severe. We urge the Commission to consider the following 4 points in their recommendations to the President. 1, we need to educate about all risks of opioid use, including withdrawal symptoms. One option is to federally fund and expand the CDC's campaign on opioid misuse. 2, we need to include withdrawal strategies and opioid-based pain management protocols to minimize unnecessary opioid use. 3, we need to encourage intervention and addiction recovery strategies that consider both physiological and psychological components of opioid use disorder. And 4, we need to be more thoughtful about the consequences of delaying access to evidence-based treatments. This underscores the need for favorable public and private reimbursement, like removing prior authorizations and other restrictions, a point I think everyone across the table has agreed with. We hope this testimony illuminates the role withdrawal plays in our urgent fight. To close, withdrawal is a common denominator and a critical window for intervention that should be addressed. Let's get every patient off the bathroom floor and into recovery. Thank you again for the privilege to talk today and for the important work you're doing.
Kristen, thank you very much. Appreciate that. And I'm going to open it up now for individual members of the commission to ask questions. I'll start off, and then we'll turn around to whoever else has questions. I want to start off with Richard. Talk to us, Richard, about, in greater detail, if you would, about Section 303 in CARA and what the real-life effect is on patients by not having even the limited number of medication-assisted treatments that we have available now, available to all patients, rather than just going to some place where only 1 or 2 are available.
It's a fascinating feature of the addiction treatment landscape, unlike many other areas of medicine, where the treatment that you get is largely dictated by what door you walk into. Methadone clinics tend to give methadone, and Suboxone doctors tend to prescribe Suboxone, and the few number of doctors who do Vivitrol tend to focus on Vivitrol. Unlike other areas of medicine where it's much driven by an understanding of the overall body of evidence, and then tailoring a specific therapy to the goals and aspirations and circumstances of a particular patient. So it requires training and availability of the facilities to administer these different medicines. Section 303 of CARA addresses this directly. It basically says physicians should be able to prescribe directly or by referral all 3 medicines. And we think it's just so important that patients are aware, and particularly for young patients, that their parents are aware that these medications, the range of them exist, and you should know the facts and the data and make a decision. And I think that would make it much more like other mainstream areas of medicine.
I'll just follow up quickly. What, in your experience, what is not being done by the government that needs to be done to enforce Section 303 of CARA? Because if you know, one of the things the commission wants to do is to make a recommendation. You know, I'd like us to be specific if we decide what to do, which agencies and what would, in your experience, be the necessary instruction or instructions to them to make sure that the law is being enforced.
Well, historically, the government has played an incredibly important role in policies around opioid treatment for the advent of methadone clinics decades ago. A lot of the training happens through SAMHSA, and SAMHSA is tasked with this process of waivering doctors for buprenorphine administration, which is appropriate, but also training and ongoing certification. So I think we have an established base in this country of methadone clinics that are bricks and mortar places where opioid treatment is being administered every day in the community. I think that's an important base for expanded treatment using other modalities, and I think education and training are essential to this, Governor.
One other thing, I'm sorry, I'll open it up to everybody else, is this training that physicians need significantly different to administer this from methadone, Suboxone to Vivitrol?
Yes. Yeah, a necessary prerequisite, as a couple folks have mentioned, to initiating on Vivitrol. Vivitrol blocks these opioid receptors in the brain. If you're actively addicted to an opioid and you get a Vivitrol injection, you'll go into withdrawal that you just heard is so painful. So detox is an incredibly important part of the initiation of Vivitrol. Many treatment centers around the country, believe it or not, don't even have doctors. Many of them have never detoxed a patient. Many simply use agonist or replacement therapy. So the other thing is just administering an injectable medicine. Often injection facilities aren't around, and what I refer to in my remarks, often physicians aren't compensated for the extra time and effort to schedule a patient, give an injection, monitor their progress, administer psychosocial counseling, all the things that go into the holistic approach to treating the patient.
Thank you, Richard. Who'd like to go next? Governor Cooper.
First, I'm amazed at the innovation, the novel ideas around this table, and I'd read about a number of them, but it's fascinating to hear them, and we could ask you a lot of questions about how they work, but it's amazing how the entrepreneurial and innovation society works. It's important. But I think it's pretty clear that a significant part of the healthcare industry, including pharmaceuticals, bear significant responsibility for this opioid crisis. So I think it's a moral imperative that the healthcare industry, and particularly the pharmaceutical industry, work to try to solve it. And I'm intrigued, Dr. Collins and President Ubel, by this public-private partnership. And we've heard some of the barriers being regulatory, financial, reimbursement issues, capital. I'm interested to know what we could do to help further this public-private partnership. I know there's a lot of intricacies about who bears the risk and who gets the profits, and I don't know how all that's going to work. But what could we do? What could we recommend to federal government about how your work could get speed, could catch on to make sure that positive results occur?
Thank you for that question. I think there's a lot that still needs to happen, but I must say your interim recommendations highlighting the need for this partnership has already been very helpful in getting us this far, and certainly Governor Christie's involvement, particularly with the Trenton meeting, carried that to another level. There's a bunch of things that need to happen, and some of this is going to come down to how we're going to support this kind of a partnership. And I will just speak from the NIH perspective. We do not at the present time have any special appropriation for the things we're talking about. We will figure out how to redirect funds from other areas to this very high priority effort, but they will not be sufficient to go at the pace that we would like to go. The funds that have so far gone towards the management of the opioid crisis have been, and appropriately so, for management of patients and grants out to the states. But if we are seriously going to make this go as fast as it needs to, there's a lot of things we need to do to stimulate this partnership from the NIH perspective. That will include setting up a really vigorous clinical trials network, focused particularly on individuals who have a very high need for pain relief and perhaps a more homogeneous kind of pain syndrome. Let me explain what I mean. It's difficult if you're trying to test a new non-addictive pain medicine to basically try it out on anybody who has chronic pain, because you're probably talking about dozens of different conditions. It's much more powerful to be able to pick out a subset that are more homogeneous. So for instance, people who have trigeminal neuralgia, a terrible kind of pain syndrome involving the fifth nerve, or something such as a patient who has post-herpetic neuralgia after shingles, and to be able then to test out of pain medicine in that circumstance, we need to set up those cohorts and have those ready to go with new opportunities for pain medicine, and industry is very interested in that. We've talked about that as part of this partnership. That's going to take resources. We're ready to go flat out, but it's certainly a pretty near future here. We need to figure out how can we really speed this process up with additional resources. In terms of the other things that you could be doing to help, I think the fact that FDA is already deeply engaged here has been noted, and again, to speed up the process of regulatory approval. The reimbursement issues certainly are critical. Everyone has raised those as well, because that otherwise could be quite an inhibition against what people might see as an opportunity for success here. If we develop a whole lot of powerful new non-addictive pain medicines, but the third parties won't pay for them, then we haven't achieved very much. Steve, you may want to say more.
Governor Baker. Oh, sorry, Governor Cooper, continue. Steve.
I was just going to add briefly that I think we do have critical mass coming out of the Trenton meeting, great enthusiasm within our membership. I think as the work plan gets developed and resources associated with that work plan are nailed down with Dr. Collins and others, that industry will be prepared to do its share moving forward. We agree that it's a multifactorial problem, but our industry has a role to play in the solution, not only the public-private partnership, but other issues we've discussed today.
Sorry, you have more work. Sorry, Governor Baker.
Let me also share the appreciation for your time and your thoughts here today. I just have a couple of questions. I'm going to start with Dr. Crystal. We consume 80% of the world's opioids in the U.S. We only represent 5% of the world's population. You mentioned, so clearly some of our reimbursement programs work quite well. I'd be curious in knowing what people do in the U.K. if they don't do this.
Not consuming as many opioids.
Well, I was hoping I'd get a little more on the how instead of the how much.
So you mean, how do we typically treat pain?
Yeah, what people do as an alternative. Because obviously in most of the Western democracies, people don't do it the way we do it in the U.S., period.
So typically, it is an escalation approach. So in general, starting with what one would consider as a physician to be the minimum effective medication at the lowest dose, and incrementally providing more. So acetaminophen is widely used in the United Kingdom. It's paracetamol, the name of the medication. And typically that's what one would start with for, I would say, mild even to moderate pain, and then combining that with potentially ibuprofen. That's a typical combination for perhaps most musculoskeletal types of injuries and pain that typically one might see in the ER. Then the consideration around, well, if that's still not satisfactorily managed, then yes, an opioid would be deployed, but typically a more mild opioid to start with, such as codeine. And again, limiting certainly the supply initially prescribed even to take home for a patient. So I hear 7 days, restricting prescribing to 7 days. That's typical what the maximum you would typically provide a patient to take home after a routine surgery. The other consideration is, just to be absolutely clear, if someone comes in from a mass trauma and they're extremely traumatized, it's not a matter of start with acetaminophen there. You would then, in that situation, acutely give something much stronger. But I think you understand the escalation is the first thing, limiting the amount of whatever you might give. Because even, let's be honest, non-steroidal medication like ibuprofen does still have side effects, so it's not that there's an automatic home run in any situation.
Do you guys have, I mean, is pain management, pain therapy something that's part of what you need to go through to get through medical school?
Yes. Again, just the kind of the warning sign. I've not practiced in a full-time capacity for 10 years, so things might have changed. But nevertheless, certainly when I was at medical school, yes, there's training around around pain management in general. Because opioid medications such as the stronger, more potent painkillers just weren't as prevalent and still not so as much in not just the United Kingdom, but the rest of Europe as well. It wasn't even necessarily taught as a tool to be used to treat pain. So I'm not, again, but just to be absolutely clear, I'm not saying that the rest of the world have got it right and the US has got it entirely wrong.
I'm not trying to put you on the spot here,
That's
okay?
fine. I'm happy to be
But I am going to put you on the spot because I don't understand why, if so much of the rest of the world doesn't do it this way, why we wouldn't chase some of the procedures and protocols that people have proven work in other parts of the world more aggressively instead of, I mean, you guys aren't even going to the 3-day CDC limit. You know, we're starting at 7, which is great. I mean, that's what the law is in Massachusetts, but people can jam a heck of a lot of opioids into a 7-day prescription. And I guess the question I would ask is why not start with what other parts of the world are already doing that seem to have dramatically reduced the downside risks associated with all of this stuff, instead of sort of starting from the top and trying to work our way down to some point where we're just a little less awful than we were before. I grant that's a tough question, but on some level, I don't get it.
Question is for Steve.
Steve, or for Dr. Collins?
Again, from the research perspective, I think you're asking a question that should involve careful examination of different practices and see what we can learn from them, sort of observational research. I think, frankly, we in this country made a terrible mistake back in the late 1990s. I'm a physician, so I will own this as something that the medical profession was part of. There was this sense that pain was not something that anybody should be going through. Physicians were even judged by whether they had succeeded in that, in terms of how reimbursement might happen from third parties, by whether their patients had any experience of pain. Pain became part of the vital signs, and it was supposed to be 0. And there was this notion that opioid prescription for somebody who actually had physical pain would not lead to addiction, something that was absolutely wrong. That is sort of those are the seeds that were sown 20 years ago that have led us to the terrible mess that we're in right now, with 80% of people who are now addicted starting on a prescription for opioids. The rest of the world didn't do that. They didn't make that mistake. So we are trying to recover from the sins of our own misunderstanding of how these pathways worked and how dangerous these drugs could be. And so maybe the rest of the world hasn't had to work so hard in terms of preventing the mess because they didn't cause it in the first place. We did. But we could still learn from those experiences. I take your point.
Just one more quick one, which is there's sort of 2 schools of thought I hear here. One school of thought is what I would describe as sort of the Vivitrol approach, which is, you know, detox and blocking, or blocking and detox, some comment, you know, however you want to frame it. The other one is sort of either a change in the delivery model, which is what some of these proposals are, but they're really just substituting what I would describe as sort of one opiate for another. Now, admittedly, one that somebody might be able to sort of function more normally and consistently with than sort of a straight-out addiction. But I guess I'm just curious to hear if there are thoughts about, because those are 2 very different strategies from just a healthcare provision and a clinical point of view. And I'd just be curious to hear if people have thoughts on that, because, you know, methadone is a substitute, Suboxone is a substitute. What you're talking about, Richard, is different. And I guess I'd be interested in hearing sort of how people think about that at a sort of global level with respect to strategy around this stuff.
Governor, first of all, good to see you. And I'll give
Massachusetts-based company.
I'll give a brief, and then other colleagues, because you might expect me to be a blind acolyte for the use of Vivitrol, which I am not. And the answer to your question is that if you know somebody, as I do, whose kid is sourcing street-based fentanyl and at risk of dying in a bathroom with a needle in their arm, getting that kid onto replacement therapy is going to save their life. And they're not ready for Vivitrol yet. They're not sure they don't want to stop using opioids. They might want to be dilettantes. They might want to dabble in it. When you're ready to go on Vivitrol, you're ready to be done on that merry-go-round. So you're willing to go through detox, typically medically assisted, and you go onto a shot once a month and it blocks your opioid receptors. That's for a completely different person than somebody who might want to be on replacement therapy. And I think both are super important. That goes back to this 303 thing. Everybody should know about all of them, and they should know the evidence around them, and they should be able to compare them and make it. And you know what? I might not be ready for Vivitrol this month, but maybe 6 months from now, after I've had a few other things happen in my life, maybe I am.
Yeah, I'd like to, if I could, sorry, I would love to build on Richard's answer there. I think, sorry, can you hear me okay? Thank you for that answer, Richard. I appreciate that, and I fundamentally agree with that. That we need multiple options here. I mean, I just had a friend of mine who lost, his son at college, and it was very early in treatment. And just as Richard says, the vast amount of patients that we have addicted to opioids today need multiple solutions. And it turns out that having those multiple solutions and allowing and empowering physicians and ultimately patients and their families to make the decision that is best suited for them will indeed save lives. And I think it's, I think it's insane that patients of all shapes and sizes can go get an opioid that, maybe a Schedule II highly addictive opioid, easier than they can get treatment to treat the addiction. We've got to stop this. We have to enforce the Mental Health and Substance Abuse Parity Act. It's been around for better part of a decade. It's time to, walk the talk here and just make that happen, because I think that's step one in helping correct this crisis.
Governor Baker, could I suggest, I'm sorry.
So I think as the other speakers have said, it's not a one-stop shop. It isn't one or the other. So if you look at some chronic disease like diabetes, right, there's lots of different options. Because a patient may need an oral medication, or they may need an injectable. Even when they get an injectable, they may need different types of insulin. Similarly, opioid addiction and opioid use disorder is a complex mental health illness. It's not just about the physical symptoms. There's also the mental aspects of it. And that's why you need to have a combination package of medication-assisted treatments, which could be naltrexone for a particular phase for a particular patient, or it could be buprenorphine, or it could be methadone. However, let's not forget, they also need behavioral counseling, social support, which right now is just appalling how that's being reimbursed right now. I went to a methadone clinic, they're getting 2 hours of reimbursed time for counseling. And you're never going to be able to fully support the patient on their recovery without those. So, it really has to be a multifactorial approach. No single approach is going to fit every patient. We need to have multiple options, and this field is so behind compared to all the other fields that are out there, like cancer.
With all due respect, so is the front end. Get a lot more aggressive on the front end, and maybe people get a little more aggressive on the backside, too.
Yeah. Thank you, Governor Baker. I'd like to marry both of your comments, frankly. The European medical system has been much more aggressive in the use of enhanced recovery after surgery protocols. And they've been very aggressive in very specific treatment regimens that lead to a desired outcome, and then force the medical system way more than we have to date in order to achieve those same endpoints. Today in America, we have our major medical systems, our academic centers have developed many of the same protocols, and in many, many cases in concert with their colleagues in Europe. The issue is that because it is a pure additional cost to the bundled system that we have in place, that there is a disincentive for our clinicians and for our hospitals themselves to actually employ these ERAS protocols that exist now just as they do in Europe. But we're asking folks to take on the expense of those additional treatment regimens to achieve the desired endpoint that you've outlined in Europe. We have the tools to achieve that. We need some help from the Commission in terms of leveling the playing field so that our clinicians have the same opportunity to use those products that they do in Europe.
Dr. Collins, do you have something you wanted to add?
I think what we're all saying is that there's an important transition underway in medicine across the board, but it needs to apply here perhaps more than anywhere, and that is this idea of precision medicine, that we don't try to do one size fits all, because we're all different. And So if you're trying to help somebody who has been trapped in this terrible cycle of addiction, the more options you have to offer them, and that you make sure when they go for the opportunity for an intervention that all those options are on the table so you can do the match. You've heard about that from these companies that are developing additional ones, particularly in terms of how often you have to receive the medication, how it's going to be delivered. That's going to help a lot, expanding that set of options. But most importantly, perhaps for the future, we need additional precision medicine options for people who have pain, who are looking for some kind of relief, for which opioids have turned out to be ineffective and dangerous. And the development of that new panoply of medicines and the ability to then match them to that particular individual's kind of pain is where we need to go. So precision medicine for pain treatment, precision medicine for opioid addiction treatment, just like we now are talking about precision medicine for cancer. That's the path we need to be on.
Bertha.
Yes. I'm wondering, with regard to the representatives from pharmaceutical industry, how long they think that drugs that are in the pipeline for FDA approval should be evaluated, especially opioids and other drugs that could have abuse potential or long-term unintended adverse effects. Because we know with regard to the opioids, they were not evaluated for more than a few months. And then they were approved, and now we hear of people being treated chronically for months and years at a time. And what would be, from the perspective of the pharmaceutical companies, a reasonable FDA process for evaluation? Or should it be post-marketing surveillance?
Who wants to swing at that one? I think you all have opinions on that, I suspect. Who wants to go first? Sure.
Just bring up the perspective of a company that is working on the development of new therapies that are non-addictive and do not involve opioids. So I think a real tragedy, additional tragedy of the opioid crisis is actually that we don't do a very good job handling chronic pain. And one thing we have to remember is that one of the drivers for the opioid crisis is this thought that opioids are effective long-term for pain, and too often, as Dr. Collins just pointed out, it doesn't work that way. So for the coal miner in West Virginia, goes to his doctor, and the patient has been working in the coal mines and has severe low back pain. What is to be offered to this person? And the fact is today that the options are quite limited. And so I think one of the things that the commission, I would advise, consider in terms of making its recommendations is that part of the solution is looking for innovative therapies. Now, how long should that take? Well, I think the issue is that the FDA process fundamentally is a good one. Safety, efficacy, and these things take time to work out. I think, however, there can be attention and improvements made in terms of accessibility, in terms of timeliness of reviews, in terms of addressing fairly simple issues with regard to guidance from the FDA to the companies that are doing the innovative therapies. Drug development is hugely expensive, and I do think that we can make improvements in terms of bringing about innovative therapies more quickly by doing these things.
All right.
But for example, a company that's working on the trace receptor potential vanilloid receptor targets, that's not an addictive target. On the other hand, it's going to be used for chronic pain. Some of the indications for these are nociceptive receptors. How long do you think the outcomes should be monitored for in order to garner FDA approval? If you're only going to look at it for, let's say, 3 months, but this person could be on it for 5 years.
So I think I can answer on that. So ICH guidelines require safety be demonstrated for a year. And I think the FDA does a good job of coming to the right answers about looking at safety issues, and they take into consideration how the drug works and what its indications are and the unmet need. And so I think looking at safety and efficacy are done the right way. I think where it does take a long time to develop the new drugs, and I think this can be done in a more timely way. One thing I'd also like to just direct the Commission to, and this was really illuminating because I hadn't previously looked this up, but over the past 5 years, in terms of the approvals of new pain drugs at the analgesia division, there have been 13, 5 years, 13 approvals. 11 of those had to do with opioid variants, no new chemical entities. 2 had to do with aspirin-like drugs, NSAIDs. Again, no new chemical entities. So in 5 years, regardless of this crisis, we've had no new chemical entities approved for addressing pain. I think that points to a difficulty in terms of what's happening with regard to industry's participation in finding the solutions for chronic pain. And so there are some real issues there that need to be addressed.
Anyone else have comments on that question, or do any of the commissioners have any other questions? Patrick, sure.
Thank you. I really enjoyed hearing about psychic pain. Clearly, depression is rampant, and the idea that the opioid crisis wasn't also driven by a depression crisis. I'm going from here to the National Alliance for Suicide Prevention because this is Suicide Prevention Month. And while we're talking about the opioid crisis and overdose deaths, suicide is getting right up there to the height of the AIDS epidemic itself. And of course, overdoses far surpass that. So we have a combined issue here. And I really appreciate the comments about segmenting these illnesses because of the complexity of them and the fact that we probably should have orphan drug status because these are a multitude of various types of depression, much like autism has a number of types of autism. And maybe for single indications, depending on a particular genetic type for the person, you have a particular personalized medicine, like Dr. Collins was talking about. I think this meeting, Governor Christie, has been very, very helpful because I think it opens up the possibility that we should really be at it. In that moonshot reference over here that James mentioned, we need to do this because we're about having to save so many Americans who are dying of both suicide and overdose. I really appreciate everyone mentioning, I mean, it was almost like you were reading from my script about parity. And the need for us to enforce the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act next year being the 10th anniversary of it. That's really done at every state. So I'm just putting an ask out to all of you who have obviously a vested interest in having these formularies adequately covered, that we have what we call parity registry, which is a way for us to get patients to tell their stories about how they were denied access to the medications that you've spent so much time trying to come up with. If we take those stories and then take them to the attorneys general in each state, we can then investigate these insurance companies for their pattern and practice of more onerous medical management decision-making on the mental health addiction side when compared to the medical and surgical side, as is required under federal law. And so, so much of that needs to happen, and you can all be very helpful to us by giving us consumers for each state. We have what's known as Parity Track, which is a way for us to evaluate each single state on how it's progressing towards the goal of treating these illnesses the same as any other set of illnesses. But as you all know, because these illnesses are so stigmatized, the advocacy is really anemic. There's no one out there shaking the trees as if this were HIV/AIDS or some other crisis like we saw in those crises. So we need your help because you often are in touch with the constituent consumer organizations, and we appreciate that. So finally, let me just say, so many of you commented about the lack of community resources that get reimbursed that go concurrent with the prescribing of the medication. And I would just hope this commission takes into account that we're not just driven by the medical model, even though we're talking about this as a disease and it needs to be treated with that medical indication for a drug, but it needs to be paired, as everyone said, with that mental health component, which often is not reimbursed. And I might add, because CMS hasn't done what it needs to do to make sure that it's properly reimbursed. So this is this complex problem that everyone's spoken about, and I do think, Governor, that it does take getting a pharmaceutical company, which, as my colleagues have said, owns a lot of the responsibility, some of their members more than others, for this opioid crisis. But it takes the insurance community, which also owns this to a large extent because they've denied adequate treatment to folks, and they've ended up having to come stage 4 addiction patients before they get any kind of treatment whatsoever because of the insurance barriers. And it really requires all of us. So again, Governor, thank you so much for allowing to be on this commission with you. And for anyone else who doesn't know, the governor made an announcement last week in New Jersey that New Jersey was going to be the #1 state in the country for tackling this crisis, and it started with a $200 million appropriation for all series of issues to treat addiction, which would make New Jersey spending half of what's being spent nationally on this crisis because of the governor's leadership.
Thank you, Congressman. Appreciate it. I'm going to turn to Attorney General Bondi in a moment, but I also want to point out on the equity issue, and I think both governors would agree with this, this is also an issue for the Labor Department at the federal level. In our state, for instance, 70% of the employer-provided insurance plans are regulated not by the State Department of Insurance, but are regulated by the Federal Department of Labor. And so this issue of the insurance companies, and I'm going to be recommending a panel like this with the insurance industry as well before we do our final report, is we need the Federal Department of Labor to step up and enforce the Parity Act as well. I think that on the whole, states vary in terms of the way they enforce it, depending upon their structure. But in my state, I only wind up regulating 30% of the employer-based health insurance plans in my state. The rest are regulated by the Federal Department of Labor. So hope that we'll have Secretary Acosta sitting in Secretary Shulkin's seat the next time we get together here, because there's got to be answers to that question of why that hasn't been done in the 10 years under 2 previous administrations and now a third. And that's unacceptable. And that's middle-class citizens who are working hard, getting health benefits. They're not covered by Medicaid. They're not paying out of pocket because they can't afford to, but they're paying for insurance, and they're not getting the benefits that they're supposed to be getting. But if they had cancer, they would be getting those benefits. And I don't understand what the difference is between the two because they're killing our citizens, both of them are. Attorney General Bondi.
Thank you. Thank you, Governor Christie. And just to, I'm not going to echo what Congressman Kennedy said, but I wholeheartedly agree. And Mr. Pops, thank you for giving such a good basic description of, I think we often are getting mental health and drug addiction merged when we often don't have to, and I think that's what's happening. I think many mental health, we just write it off as a dual diagnosis, and often at times it doesn't need to be. So thank you for the product that you're developing. I think that's very important because our suicide rate in Florida is through the roof, and I feel we're lacking sufficient mental health treatment as well. But it's all tied into what we're talking about, gentlemen and ladies, today. Dr. Crystal, thank you to your company for inventing Narcan. You said you invented Narcan?
Nasal spray.
Yes. Okay, you have saved so many first responders' lives in my state, I can't begin to tell you. And if any of you in this room, here's my ask to you, Ampistar and Adapt have both agreed to dramatically discount the price of Narcan and naloxone to my state. And we need to do that on a national level. If you have any similar products, we have got to have that in our country. Palm Beach firefighters are going through it. They cannot, they're blowing through their entire budget on Narcan and naloxone. It's saving lives. You're reading about it every single day. The addicts, of course, but also our first responders. And so we need it to treat our addicts and our first responders. We've got to drive the price of it down, please. Mr. Durkatz, Ms. Gulow's statements were so vivid and so incredible, talking about, I think we need to hear that all the time, what an addict goes through. I can tell you firsthand from seeing it that the babies go through exactly what she described and more. Their incubators have to be covered. They're sensitive to light, sound, touch, everything. Your product is going to be a game changer. I cannot thank you enough. Would that also be, would that be able to be administered to pregnant women as well?
So yes, we will. And sorry, we are exploring the idea of looking at this product to also be administered and ultimately utilized for NAS, for infants that are born with this awful condition. Now, this is, we are, way off of, and it's going to take a lot of time to get there, but that's the vision. And thank you for your comments about what a game changer this product can be. We think the delivery model really does change the game. If you think about what an addict goes through every day, they're not only reminded of their disease every day when they're taking a daily med, but they're also having to make that decision as to whether or not they want to remain addiction-free. And we want to change that paradigm and really put the physician, the HCP, and the patient back in control.
Thank you. Thank you, Governor.
Attorney General Bondi, thank you. Any other questions from any of the other commissioners for any of the members of the panel?
Just had one
sure.
for
Bertha.
You mentioned the concept of having everyone who has been rescued have access to medications-assisted treatment and to treatment immediately. The problem is, if you look at the New Hampshire data, 75% are dying alone at home. And if we generate over-the-counter naloxone, how are we going to identify and help the people who are currently dying?
I think one of the things that we're going to have to explore, especially for people who are living alone, is the use of technology, right? So a lot more companies are coming into this field. There are sensors where now doctors are going through telemedicine and they are providing care, including measuring respiratory rates and blood pressure, right? And so I do think that once these patients get into care, we're going to have to figure out different technologies. For example, like Paratherapeutics is doing, that supplements medication, so that, for example, can we deliver behavioral counseling, or when a patient is in treatment and they're starting to feel the cravings going up, can the doctor intervene? I think if I was taking care of a patient and I knew the cravings levels are going up, I may call the patient and say, you might need to come in, or maybe we need to change your dose. So I think the technology needs to marry into the treatment options that are currently available, because a lot of people are alone. So how do we reach them in a more, I guess, systematic and consistent fashion?
Dr. Sabaya, just to follow up with that, I'd be interested to get the recommendations maybe after this hearing from all of you in this room regarding the telehealth, digital health world, because so much of what you do is going to also be complemented in the future, as many of you talked about, with a multimodal form of therapy where you combine your medication with, kind of the applications that we're seeing that will help people with cognitive behavioral therapy through software development, stuff like that. But I also want to ask you all to comment about the Ryan Haidt Act, and particularly prescribing through telemedicine these Schedule II medications, because I think that we've got such an epidemic in the rural areas without adequate coverage with physicians that it'll be important that we're able to do that. Of course, I think it's our Commission's general inclination to move forward in that, and we've made reference to that in the interim report, but it'd be good to get some validation from your vantage point on these really unrepresented communities around the country that don't have any service in terms of adequate clinician representation or population to meet the need, and how telemedicine could be helpful to helping your products get prescribed to the right patients who wouldn't otherwise have access to them.
Can I just add two things? So one is, as the commission is looking at possibly telemedicine playing a role, one of the things are the laws for telemedicine change from state to state. And so there's got to be some harmonization of what, with that to be consistent. The other thing is, just in terms of the rural areas, the distribution laws that are currently in place needs to adapt as new innovations come, right? Because right now, it's based on oral treatments. And as more injectables come in, the distribution laws have to be able to change, and the DEA has put in place so that a prescriber, for example, who's in a big city, could, if there's a patient in a rural town in Montana, should be able to coordinate so that the injection can go from a specialty pharmacist to that rural local physician can administer it. Instead, currently what's happening is when patients are in these rural communities, they have to drive hours on end to get to a tertiary care center to be able to receive treatment, which is not really equitable for patients.
Thank you. And to go back to your original point, one of the issues that we're dealing with in our state that we found to have some effectiveness on the original point you brought up was the use of recovery coaches in hospitals. We've now expanded that program to every hospital in our state, so that if you come in and you're reversed with naloxone, after you're stabilized, the first person you see is a recovery coach who's trained and who has the resources available to move you towards detox if that's appropriate, or to long-term inpatient treatment or intensive outpatient treatment, depending upon how the patient presents. And that person almost always, in about 80% of the instances now, is a recovering addict. And so they can speak to the patient in a way that is, we found at least to be much more effective. And we ran this as a pilot for 2 years before we now expanded it to the rest of the state. And in those counties where we did it, we saw double-digit reductions in relapse by having someone who can direct them and not just release them. One of the stories that we heard repeatedly around our state was that if you came in, you had been reversed by naloxone, all you were asked by the physician afterwards was, did you have suicidal ideations? If you had suicidal ideations, they would put you and admit you for 3 days to be observed. If you said you didn't have suicidal ideations, they released you immediately. So one young man who was in a treatment facility that I went to visit in my state said to me, I heard this guy next to me saying that he thought about committing suicide, and they put him in. And I turned to him afterwards and said, wow, that's awful. You thought about committing suicide. And he said, no, I didn't think about committing suicide, but that's the only way they'll put me in the hospital. He said, so now I can detox. So this guy said the next time he overdosed, just to think about that for a second, the next time he overdosed and was reversed again, he told the hospital that he was thinking about killing himself so he could detox. And he said, and that's when he was able then to get to treatment, right? So having someone there who, can direct someone right away is not a cure-all, but we've seen double-digit reductions in relapse in our targeted counties for that program. And now we're expanding it to the entire state. Yes, Corey.
I think Governor Christie, just building on your comments, by all rights, this has been a very pharmacocentric conversation. And whether we're prescribing methadone or buprenorphine or Vivitrol, that alone is not sufficient to treat opiate use disorder. Multimodal therapy is standard of care. Most of these drugs have been evaluated in the context of a multimodal treatment paradigm, and it's not enough to just get these patients access to medication. We need to also be providing access to very dedicated support services and cognitive behavioral therapy, whether that is adequately trained face-to-face therapists or pieces of software. I would argue that it's incredibly important for the Commission to not lose sight of that, because it's effectively as big as the question of all of the drugs together.
Charlie.
Just on the politics of the suicide versus no suicide ideation with respect to getting into treatment. When we filed our bill on opioid addiction, we had a similar provision in there that would basically say if you overdosed and were brought back by a hospital, that the hospital would have the ability to treat you the same way they might somebody who they would commit for 3 days, just so you get your head clear, and then somebody could have a conversation with you about whether or not you could get into treatment. We couldn't get that through the legislature. So this is a hard one, and I'm not exactly sure why, other than I think there's a lot going on in an ER, and I think people were concerned about having one more thing to do there. But that is as good an opportunity as you're ever going to have to get somebody to seriously consider getting into treatment.
And by the way,
if they're not willing to volunteer that, it's a lot harder to figure out how to stay in touch with them long enough for them to actually clear their head a bit to have them make that decision.
by the way, that's where we faced some of those same challenges that you did, and the Recovery Coach program was in part a workaround from that requirement. Yes.
No, and I've heard, I want to thank you again, Governor, but we've heard some fantastic recommendations, and yet there's one that actually I could not stop to bring it up, because Dr. Campbell very explicitly stated that we should consider the notion of orphan designation and provide some incentives for pharmaceutical to develop pain medications that are non-addictive. And I'm going to say that it also would be very valuable to explicitly address the same issue for pharmaceuticals that are interested in developing medications for opioid use disorders. The ability to incentivize them in a way that may not cost the government, for example, through vouchers to a priority review process. And this is something that would bring pharmaceuticals that otherwise would not be willing to invest in this space an opportunity to want to do so. We have struggled for years to try to get investments of pharmaceuticals into the development of medications of substance use disorders. So to be able to get them on board in a wider level would allow us to accelerate very much the rate at which we can come up with solutions.
Great. I am mindful of our time. We started 5 minutes late, and we're ending 15 minutes late, so we're right on time now. For Washington, we were ahead of time, but now we're right on time. I want to thank all of the folks who have been here today on this panel. We appreciate it very much. If there is additional information you want us to have to submit in writing, please submit it to us, and it will be considered and considered for inclusion in the final report. But what you're all doing is very exciting, and some of your practical recommendations as well are important to us. And Commission will be getting together again soon to deal with the insurance issue before we issue our final report, and maybe 2 more meetings before we issue our final report. So I want to thank Congressman Kennedy and Governor Cooper, Governor Baker, Professor Mattress for their hard work, and in absentia, Attorney General Bondi. Appreciate the support from ONDCP and the NIH, and I thank Pharma for their support and for being here today and their continued participation. The meeting is now adjourned, and I thank you all for being here.